There is a reason your spirit has felt unsettled lately, and no, it is not your imagination. Something enormous is approaching, something that will reach far deeper than a simple emotional shift or another temporary relationship conflict. In less than 48 hours, a hidden structure inside your heart is going to crack open, and when it does, the version of love you have been clinging to may no longer survive the truth that follows. This is not about losing control of your outer world. This is about losing the illusion that has been quietly controlling your inner world for far too long. Friday, May 22nd, carries one of the most emotionally explosive astrological combinations of the entire year. Venus, ruler of love, attachment, desire, intimacy, and emotional connection, moves into a direct square with Neptune, the planet that dissolves boundaries and clouds reality with fantasy. This is not soft energy. This is not the kind of transit that lets people comfortably continue pretending. This is the kind of alignment that pulls the curtain back with force. It exposes the emotional stories people have built their lives around. It reveals where longing became obsession, where hope became denial, and where emotional dependency disguised itself as unconditional love. Most people will feel this pressure rising without understanding why. They will think their anxiety is random. They will assume their relationships are suddenly unstable. They will blame stress, exhaustion, bad timing, or emotional distance. But beneath all of that, something far more spiritual is taking place. And if you found yourself here listening to this message right now, then part of you already senses that something is changing beneath the surface of your life. Maybe you have felt emotionally exhausted for no clear reason. Maybe conversations have started feeling strange, heavy, disconnected. Maybe you have begun noticing inconsistencies you tried very hard not to acknowledge before. Tiny details that suddenly feel impossible to ignore. A look in someone, eyes that no longer feels genuine. A silence that says more than words. A feeling deep inside your chest that whispers something is no longer aligned, even though you desperately wanted it to be. This is the beginning of the unraveling. The next 48 hours are not simply leading toward another astrological event. They are leading toward a personal awakening that has the power to permanently alter the way you understand love itself. By Friday morning at 2:30, Venus in Cancer will lock into a precise 90-degree square with Neptune in Aries. In astrology, a square creates friction. It creates tension that cannot remain unresolved. Two energies push against one another until something breaks. Venus in Cancer longs for emotional safety. It wants tenderness, reassurance, loyalty, emotional protection. It wants to feel at home inside another human being. It wants the kind of love that feels nurturing, sacred, and deeply secure. But Neptune in Aries operates very differently. Neptune in Aries chases the fantasy. It chases the dream of the perfect rescuer, the idealized lover, the heroic figure who arrives and finally heals every wound. It creates emotional projections so powerful that people stop seeing reality and start seeing only what they want to believe. And when these two forces collide on May 22nd, the emotional fog that has surrounded your relationships begins to dissolve. The fantasies lose their grip. The emotional stories you kept repeating to yourself stop feeling convincing. Suddenly, what you avoided seeing becomes impossible to deny. What makes this even more overwhelming is what happens only 8 hours later. The Sun joins Uranus in Gemini, and this changes everything. Uranus is not subtle energy. Uranus breaks patterns suddenly. It shocks people awake. It delivers revelations like lightning striking through darkness. And when the Sun, your awareness and consciousness, merges with Uranus, it becomes almost impossible to stay asleep emotionally. This alignment forces truth into the open. It creates moments where people suddenly realize they have been betraying themselves for years without admitting it. Conversations may happen that completely shift your understanding of someone. Information may surface unexpectedly. Emotions you buried may erupt all at once. The realization may arrive so quickly that it feels almost surreal, like waking from a dream and realizing none of it was as stable as you thought. That is why May 22nd carries such transformational power. This is not one isolated transit. This is a sequence of cosmic events unfolding together with terrifying precision. Venus square. Neptune tears down the illusion. Sun conjunct. Uranus forces awareness. Then, almost immediately afterward, Venus forms a perfect trine to the North Node, the point connected to destiny and soul direction. And that is where the deeper meaning reveals itself. The collapse is not punishment. The collapse is preparation. Because once the false version of love falls apart, something more authentic finally has room to enter your life. But before that new chapter can begin, 3 specific illusions must break first. Most people spend their lives repeating emotional cycles without realizing they are trapped inside them. They choose the same emotionally unavailable partners. They repeat the same painful patterns. They confuse intensity with compatibility. They mistake longing for destiny. They chase emotionally impossible situations while convincing themselves it is love. And over time, these patterns become so familiar that they stop questioning them altogether. But on May 22nd, the universe interrupts the cycle. Whether you feel ready or not, something hidden is about to become visible. And once you see it clearly, you cannot return to who you were before. The painful part is that awakening rarely feels gentle in the moment it happens. When illusions collapse, people often feel grief before freedom. They feel disoriented before clarity. It can feel like the emotional ground beneath them is splitting apart. But that cracking sensation is not destruction alone. It is also the sound of emotional chains breaking. It is the moment your soul stops settling for distorted versions of love and begins demanding something real. The first illusion that begins collapsing under this energy is the savior and victim dynamic. This pattern destroys more relationships than people realize because it disguises itself as compassion. It begins when someone enters your life carrying obvious pain. Maybe they are emotionally unavailable. Maybe they struggle with addiction, trauma, inconsistency, avoidance, or unresolved emotional wounds. But instead of recognizing the danger immediately, you feel drawn toward it. You interpret their brokenness as proof that they need you. Deep inside, you convince yourself that your love will heal them in ways nobody else could. You start believing your patience makes you special. Your sacrifices become evidence of devotion. You tell yourself that staying proves your loyalty. But beneath that story is something much more complicated. Because often, the savior is not only trying to rescue another person, they are trying to rescue their own sense of worth. They are trying to earn love by overgiving, overfixing, overunderstanding, and overextending themselves emotionally. And under this Venus-Neptune square, that entire illusion begins to fracture. Suddenly you may realize you were not building love at all. You were building emotional dependency around the hope that one day someone would finally become who you needed them to be. You convinced yourself that staying was proof of love. You told yourself that enduring the chaos made you loyal, mature, emotionally strong. Every time you overlooked another disappointment, every time you excused behavior that quietly wounded you, a part of you believed you were protecting the relationship. But the energy building toward May 22nd is preparing to expose something far more uncomfortable. What you called loyalty may have actually been fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of being alone, fear of facing the possibility that you invested your heart into someone who could never truly meet you where you needed them to. The Venus-Neptune square does not allow emotional illusions to survive untouched, especially the illusion that suffering for someone automatically makes the connection sacred. Many people are about to discover that what they believed was unconditional love was actually emotional, self-abandonment disguised as devotion. You kept telling yourself that being patient was noble, that refusing to walk away made you stronger than everyone else who left, that if you loved deeply enough, sacrificed enough, understood enough, eventually the other person would transform. But beneath that story was another truth, hiding quietly in the shadows. Focusing entirely on another person, brokenness, allowed you to avoid confronting your own emotional wounds. Because when your entire identity revolves around rescuing someone else, you never have to ask why you feel worthy only when you are needed. You never have to examine why emotionally unavailable people feel magnetic to you. You never have to face the painful realization that stable love may actually feel unfamiliar, because chaos became your definition of connection long ago. Neptune in Aries intensifies this pattern until it begins to feel almost spiritual. It turns unhealthy emotional attachment into a mission. It convinces you that love must involve struggle, sacrifice, proving yourself through pain. It whispers that if the relationship is difficult enough, then it must be meaningful. And Venus in Cancer pours emotional attachment into that illusion even more deeply. It confuses caretaking with intimacy. It mistakes emotional exhaustion for closeness. It teaches people to believe that constantly saving another person is the same thing as being loved by them. But when the Sun joins Uranus later on, May 22nd, something shifts suddenly and irreversibly. The truth arrives fast. For some people, it will come through a conversation they never expected to have. For others, it may arrive through a shocking realization that seems to appear out of nowhere. Some will receive information that completely changes the way they see their partner. Others will simply wake up and feel something inside them click into place for the first time in years. Uranus works like lightning. It does not slowly prepare you. It reveals everything all at once. And in that moment, many people will finally understand a painful truth they have spent years avoiding. You cannot rescue someone who refuses to heal themselves. You cannot love another person into emotional maturity. You cannot sacrifice enough pieces of yourself to force another human being to become who you hoped they would be. And perhaps most devastating of all, you realize the relationship was not only hurting them, it was slowly erasing you too. That is the first illusion collapsing beneath this cosmic pressure. The belief that love requires you to disappear in order to keep someone else alive emotionally. The second illusion begins unraveling in a much quieter but equally devastating way. This is the illusion of the perfect projection. Almost everyone has experienced this at some point, even if they never admitted it out loud. You meet someone and immediately attach impossible meaning to them. Suddenly, they feel extraordinary, different from everyone else, untouchable. You convince yourself they are exactly what you have been searching for your entire life. Every interaction feels loaded with destiny. Every coincidence feels spiritual. Every moment of attention from them feels intoxicating. But what Neptune does best is not creating love. It creates enchantment. Neptune covers reality in emotional fog so dense that people stop seeing what is actually in front of them. Instead, they begin seeing their fantasies reflected back at them. And Neptune in Aries intensifies this effect through idealization. It does not simply make you admire another person. It makes you project your unmet emotional needs onto them. Your longing for safety, your childhood wounds, your desire to finally feel chosen, your hunger for spiritual connection, your desperate wish for someone to complete the parts of you that still feel broken. You begin falling in love, not with the actual human being standing before you, but with the emotional story you created around them. You call them your soulmate, your twin flame, the missing piece meant to heal everything. But in reality, you are often looking into a mirror reflecting your own desires back at you. This illusion becomes strongest when distance exists. long-distance relationships, emotionally unavailable people, impossible crushes, one-sided attachments, situations where you barely know the other person deeply enough to see their flaws clearly. These are the environments where Neptune thrives, because the less reality available, the more space fantasy has to grow. You begin filling every silence with imagination. You reinterpret inconsistency as mystery. You excuse behavior that would normally hurt you because admitting the truth would destroy the fantasy you built around them. But the energy of May 22nd is not interested in protecting fantasy any longer. When Uranus joins the Sun, it acts like a brutal spotlight switching on inside a dark room. Suddenly, every detail becomes visible. The incompatibilities you ignored begin screaming for your attention. The emotional gaps you denied become impossible to rationalize away. You see clearly that this person was never the flawless answer you convinced yourself they were. And the deepest pain does not come from realizing they disappointed you. It comes from realizing how long you abandoned your own intuition in order to preserve the illusion. The betrayal suddenly feels internal. You recognize that you chose fantasy over reality because reality felt too frightening to face. You desperately wanted someone extraordinary to arrive and save you from your emptiness. So you transformed an ordinary human being into a symbol of salvation. That is the second illusion that collapses beneath this transit. The belief that loving someone intensely enough can transform them into the person you need them to become. Then comes the third illusion, the quietest one, but also the most dangerous, because it hides beneath almost every relationship pattern people repeat. This is the illusion that remaining inside a comfortable lie is safer than confronting an uncomfortable truth. Venus in Cancer craves emotional security above everything else. It wants familiarity, predictability, emotional shelter. It wants to know what tomorrow will feel like. And because of that, many people stay inside situations that stopped nourishing them long ago, simply because the pain feels familiar. They ignore the tension in their chest. They silence their intuition. They convince themselves things are fine, because admitting the truth would force change, and change feels terrifying. This is why people remain inside relationships that have emotionally expired. This is why they avoid difficult conversations. This is why they continue pretending everything is stable while privately feeling emptier every day. Deep down, they already know something is wrong. But the idea of disrupting the illusion feels more frightening than slowly suffocating inside it. And that is exactly the illusion May 22nd is preparing to confront head-on. The reason so many people resist the truth is because truth changes everything once it arrives. The moment you fully acknowledge what your intuition has been whispering for months, sometimes years, your entire emotional reality begins to shift. Suddenly, you can no longer pretend the relationship is healthy when your spirit feels drained every time you interact with that person. You can no longer ignore the silence growing between you. You can no longer convince yourself that the future you imagined is still guaranteed. And that is what makes this energy so terrifying for many people. Facing reality means accepting that the life you carefully constructed may need to be torn apart and rebuilt from the ground up. It means admitting that the person you invested your time, your hope, your loyalty, your emotional energy into may not actually be the soul you are meant to walk beside long term. For many people, that realization feels unbearable at first, because it threatens the entire emotional identity they built around the relationship. But the transits arriving on May 22nd are exposing something critical. The security you thought you were protecting was never truly stable to begin with. It only appeared stable because denial kept covering the cracks. Deep down, many people already know the truth. They feel it during quiet moments late at night. They feel it in the exhaustion that lingers after conversations. They feel it in the growing emotional distance they keep trying to rationalize away. The foundation has been weakening for a long time. The problem is not that the cracks suddenly appeared. The problem is that fear kept you from looking directly at them. But Uranus does not allow avoidance forever. When the Sun joins Uranus in Gemini, hidden truths surface rapidly. Something arrives that changes the emotional equation permanently. It may come through words someone says unexpectedly. It may arrive through information that confirms your deepest suspicions. It may emerge through a sudden internal awakening where your own soul simply refuses to continue lying to itself. Whatever form it takes, the result is the same. Staying asleep emotionally becomes impossible. And once that moment arrives, you stand at a crossroads that will define the next chapter of your life. One path keeps you trapped inside familiar pain, because at least it feels predictable. The other path asks you to step into uncertainty, trusting that the truth, however uncomfortable, is still leading you towards something healthier, cleaner, and more aligned. This is the third illusion, collapsing beneath the weight of these cosmic alignments. The belief that avoiding reality somehow protects you from suffering, when in reality it only prolongs it. Then comes the part most people fail to understand, while everything appears to be falling apart around them. The collapse itself is not the punishment. It is the clearing. Once the emotional fog lifts, once the projections dissolve, once the unhealthy attachment patterns are exposed, space finally opens for something genuine to enter. At approximately 6:40 in the afternoon on May 22nd, only hours after the Venus-Neptune square and the Sun-Uranus conjunction shake people awake emotionally, Venus forms a perfect trine to the North Node in Pisces. This is where the energy changes direction entirely. The North Node is deeply connected to destiny, karmic evolution, soul growth, and the path your spirit is attempting to move toward in this lifetime. And a trine in astrology creates flow. It removes resistance. It opens doors naturally. This means the same day that destroys illusion also reveals alignment. The same cosmic force that tears down false love stories begins guiding people towards something more authentic almost immediately afterward. That is why this period feels so spiritually intense. The universe is not removing illusions simply to leave you empty. It is removing what blocks you from receiving what is real. Once fantasy no longer controls your vision, the path toward authentic connection becomes visible in ways it never could before. For some people, this may manifest through a sudden encounter. Someone enters their life unexpectedly, and the energy feels different immediately. There is no exhausting confusion, no endless guessing, no emotional chasing. The connection feels grounded, reciprocal, emotionally honest. It feels aligned instead of addictive. Others may experience this energy within an existing relationship that survives the emotional truth-telling of May 22nd. Once the masks fall away, the connection deepens into something more mature and sustainable, because both people are finally willing to face reality honestly together. And for many others, the most profound transformation will not arrive through another person at all. It will arrive through themselves. They will suddenly realize they spent years searching externally for love that they were refusing to cultivate internally. They will understand that the emptiness they tried to fill through validation, obsession, or emotional dependency was actually calling them back toward themselves the entire time. But there is an important spiritual law hidden within these transits. You cannot reach the harmony of the North Node trine while still clinging to the illusion created by Neptune. You cannot receive what is authentic while refusing to release what is false. That is why May 22nd functions as both a death and a rebirth simultaneously. One version of love collapses, so another version can finally emerge. The fantasy ends so reality can begin. But the story does not stop there, because another crucial test arrives only 6 days later, on May 28th, when Venus forms a square to Saturn. And this is where everything becomes undeniably real. Neptune dissolves illusion. Uranus shocks people awake. But Saturn asks the question nobody can escape. What are you actually willing to build now that the fantasy is gone? Saturn is not interested in emotional escapism. Saturn deals with structure, responsibility, endurance, and truth in physical form. It tests whether a connection can survive outside the emotional intensity that first brought two people together. The Venus-Saturn square demands maturity. It asks whether you are capable of creating love that exists beyond chemistry, fantasy, or emotional dependency. Because authentic relationships require effort. They require consistency. They require boundaries. They require choosing each other even during ordinary moments when excitement fades and reality settles in. Any relationship built entirely on illusion will struggle under Saturn pressure because there is no real foundation beneath it. Once the emotional fantasy disappears, the connection collapses under the weight of truth. But relationships rooted in honesty and genuine alignment will become stronger through this transit. Saturn gives endurance to what is authentic. It creates permanence where emotional maturity exists. It transforms temporary attraction into something capable of surviving hardship. This is why the days following May 22nd matter so much. The awakening itself is only the beginning. What follows determines whether the lessons actually become integrated into your life. When May 28th arrives, pay close attention to what your body, heart, and intuition are telling you. If a relationship suddenly feels exhausting, unnatural, emotionally heavy, or impossible to sustain without constant effort, that feeling is not random. It is information. It may be revealing that you are trying to force something your soul has already outgrown. But if a connection feels grounded, stable, emotionally safe without losing honesty, if it feels like something solid is slowly being built instead of desperately maintained, then that is a very different message entirely. That is Saturn confirming that the connection has substance beneath the surface. And this brings us to the deeper truth about Friday, May 22nd. This day is not arriving to ruin your love life. It is arriving to expose the difference between attachment and alignment, between fantasy and reality, between emotional addiction and authentic connection. And once you finally see that difference clearly, your entire understanding of love begins to transform forever. What is approaching on Friday is far more significant than another temporary emotional wave or another astrological headline. People scroll past and forget within hours. This energy carries the feeling of a threshold, the kind of moment that quietly divides your life into before and after. By the time May 22nd arrives, many people will realize they can no longer continue repeating the emotional patterns that have kept them trapped for years. This is not random cosmic chaos. This is intervention. The universe is interrupting cycles that were slowly draining your spirit, relationships that were teaching you to abandon yourself, fantasies that kept you emotionally attached to people who could never truly meet you where your soul needed to be met. And when these illusions begin collapsing, it will not feel comfortable at first. It may feel like grief. It may feel like humiliation. It may feel like waking up from a dream and realizing how much time you spent convincing yourself something unhealthy was actually love. Some people will feel anger toward themselves. Others will feel heartbreak over the realization that they ignored their intuition for far too long. You may even question whether everything you believed about connection, intimacy, and destiny was built on false foundations. But beneath that pain, something extraordinary is happening. You are not being punished. You are being released. Released from exhausting emotional cycles that demanded constant overgiving while offering almost nothing in return. Released from chasing emotionally unavailable people and calling the anxiety they triggered passion. Released from the heavy illusion that suffering for love somehow makes it more meaningful. Released from denying what your spirit already knew because the truth felt too frightening to face directly. This is what makes May 22nd so transformational. The collapse itself is not the tragedy. The collapse is the doorway. Because once the illusions dissolve, the version of love that remains is no longer built on fantasy, desperation, emotional dependency, or fear. It becomes something entirely different, something cleaner, something grounded, something real. Not the kind of relationship where you disappear trying to rescue another person from themselves. Not the kind where you worship someone's potential while ignoring who they actually are. Not the kind where you tolerate emotional crumbs simply because you are terrified of losing the connection altogether. The love waiting beyond this awakening operates differently. It is mutual instead of one-sided, honest instead of performative, stable instead of addictive. It is built by two emotionally whole people choosing each other consciously, not because they are trying to fill emptiness inside themselves, but because the connection genuinely aligns with who they are becoming. That is the deeper promise hidden inside the Venus trine to the North Node. It is not promising fantasy, it is promising alignment. It is promising the possibility of a connection that feels peaceful instead of confusing, nourishing instead of draining, expansive instead of suffocating. But in order to reach that space, something old must first fall apart. The illusion has to die before reality can finally breathe. And that means your willingness to face the truth matters deeply over these next 48 hours. You must stop pretending not to notice what your intuition has been trying to show you. You must stop silencing the inner voice that already knows where your energy has been misaligned. Ask yourself honestly what you have been avoiding. What behaviors have you continued excusing because facing them would force uncomfortable decisions? What emotional truths have you swallowed instead of speaking aloud because you feared what would happen if you finally admitted them? Somewhere inside you already know the answer. Your body knows, your exhaustion knows, your spirit knows. The problem is not lack of awareness. The problem is fear of change. But the energy arriving now is stronger than avoidance. This is why honesty becomes essential before Friday fully arrives. Write down what you feel if you must. Speak it aloud to someone you trust. Journal the truth you keep trying to outrun. Stop acting surprised by patterns you have already recognized repeatedly. The awakening becomes far less painful when you stop resisting what your soul already understands. At the same time, prepare yourself emotionally because revelations are approaching quickly under these transits. Information may arrive unexpectedly. A conversation may suddenly expose something hidden beneath the surface. You may experience a realization that strikes with almost frightening clarity. Uranus rarely whispers. It interrupts. It shocks people awake emotionally in moments they cannot ignore. And when that clarity arrives, do not rush to defend the illusion simply because it once comforted you. Do not immediately rationalize away what becomes obvious. Let yourself witness the truth fully before deciding what comes next. This is not the moment for emotional panic or dramatic reactions. Friday energy is best approached through awareness and observation. Watch what surfaces. Pay attention to how your body responds around certain people. Notice where your spirit suddenly feels lighter and where it feels restricted. Allow the emotional truth to settle naturally instead of forcing immediate decisions before clarity has fully integrated itself within you. The revelation itself is already the gift. You do not need to rush the next chapter before understanding why the previous one had to end. Most importantly, remember this. What is falling apart now may actually be clearing space for something far healthier than what you were trying so desperately to preserve. Sometimes the universe removes what no longer aligns because your soul has already outgrown it internally, even if your mind is still clinging emotionally. The illusion collapsing is not evidence that love failed you. It is evidence that your spirit is no longer willing to survive on emotional substitutes disguised as connection. Beyond this transition exists a very different kind of love story, one that does not require self-betrayal in order to maintain it, One that does not force you to shrink, over-explain, over-give, or constantly question your worth. One that feels emotionally safe without losing honesty. One aligned with your actual destiny instead of your unresolved wounds. And that is the deeper meaning behind May 22nd. It is simultaneously an ending and a beginning, a spiritual death of outdated emotional patterns and a rebirth into a more authentic understanding of connection. The only real question now is whether you are willing to release what your soul already knows, cannot continue with you into the next chapter. Because whether you are prepared or not, the universe is already beginning that process. And if this message found you at exactly the right moment, then perhaps part of you was always meant to hear it before the awakening arrived. Thank you for spending this time here and allowing yourself to move through this message fully. If this resonated deeply with your spirit, and you want to continue exploring these kinds of astrological awakenings and emotional revelations together, consider subscribing and becoming part of this journey. And if you feel called to share your own experiences, reflections, or realizations surrounding these energies, leave them in the comments below, because your story may help someone else feel less alone during their own transformation. Until next time, protect your energy, trust your intuition, and continue moving toward the version of love that never requires you to abandon yourself in order to receive it.